Joined by the wonderful Helen Palmer. Helen spoke at VID21 last year and we had a great time together, so it's great that she's come back. And we are going to explore experimenting with lifelong experiments. I like a good experiment, Helen. For people that don't know Helen, she relishes adventures in the workscape, never quite fitting in any work situation. She realized she needed to chart her own adventure for her sanity and authenticity. This includes marrying young, going to university in her 20s, not having children, not staying in one job any longer than 2.5 years, and founding her own business in a foreign country that she moved to, as in Australia. In her workscape, she's led teams while working for others, provided consulting services to clients, regularly blogged, led professional groups, spoken at conferences, created and delivered training courses, lectured and influenced the design of university courses, and mentored. She's captured a powerful framework for adventuring in a book she wrote called Self Unlimited, a vocational adventure for the 21st century. And I'd love a bit of a maverick. I'm going to call you a maverick.
Oh, brilliant. I'll take it. Thanks,
Julia. Take the maverick, because I think that we were talking before, and there's this formula to life that everyone thinks we've got to follow. And the more that we try and, throw rocks at that, I think the better off the world will be. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Take it away, my friend.
Thanks, Julia. So as Julia said, and I really like that. I'm going to take that, a maverick. So I'm hoping to demonstrate tonight that I've been walking the talk in this notion of work as a lifelong experiment. I'm going to talk about an experiment that I'm currently on, which I haven't really been sharing publicly with other people. So it will be interesting to see the reactions from people. So as I kick off, I thought it's nice to just revisit this notion of work. What is work in our life? And there's a sociologist named Marie Jahoda, and I think I've probably mispronounced her surname, but she talks work as being vital to our well-being. And there's 5 things that have popped up there. And there's 2 that I'm kind of focusing on tonight while talking about experimentation. But while you look at them, I encourage you just in the chat to send through which of these, maybe there's 1 or 2 that are really resonating for you right now in the notion of work. So there's work provides a time structure of things that might be happening in your day. It can provide regular activity. It can provide social identity and status. It can provide social contact, and it can provide a collective effort or a sense of purpose. So I'm just checking on the chat what's coming through for people. So Ingrid says purpose. Julia says that collective effort, purpose. Josie says purpose. Excellent. I think there's a few other people. Somebody says all of the above. Indeed, indeed. And I think with the COVID situation and people working from home and remote working, some of these things have possibly come more into the foreground, and some of them have gone more into the background. So in talking from an experimentation point of view and work as a context for lifelong experimentation, I'm tending to focus tonight on 2 in particular. This is around the social identity and status, kind of like, who am I? And that collective effort and purpose, and kind of like, what am I doing and who am I? And I think all of us have probably had this question from a very early age, and even if we're in our middle age now, we're probably like, who am I and what will I be when I grow up? And clearly, if you look at me, I'm a person who's got a little bit of graying hair. There are some people in life who might think, well, Helen, didn't you already grow up? But maybe as you heard from a little bit of the description that Julia gave in the introduction, I'm still playing around with things. And in some ways, I don't want to answer the question, who will I be when I grow up? Because it kind of has this finality to it. And I'm not really ready to settle on any one thing in particular. And also too, I kind of even want to challenge the notion, and this is part of that maverick thing, about that there's almost this sense of who I will be is tied to work as this kind of paying gig thing that probably finishes around the age 65, because I'm hoping to have energy and interest almost right up to the point that I'm about to drop into the grave. Hi, Josie. And I'm thinking that's the Josie I know. That cartoon image I got from somebody online. So if I can probably find them if you want to have one done for yourself. So this big question about who I want to be, when I think about my own life in terms of what are those titles I've held, what has been maybe my identity around them, there's been a list of serial work. So I started my first job in 1985. And I had the title Data Processor Deputy Computer Administrator, which is probably quite telling from a generational point of view of the world and what was going on then. And then this is literally the list of all the titles I've held in serial order up until about 2012. And there's kind of something distinctive about 2012 because that's at a point when I started adding other things into my workscape. And I'll come back to you in a moment to explain that word workscape. But other things that it kind of became a situation where it wasn't so much serial work, but parallel work that I was doing. So when people would ask me like, what do you do? Or what's your career? I'm like, who am I talking to and what might be relevant to say here? Because there were so many things that I could list. Now, I don't know about you, but I have trouble then when you get some government form and they've given you 12 spaces on a form to say, what is your occupation and what do you do? So what do you put in there? So I'm curious, for those of you on the call, would you drop in the chat what you would put in the 12 characters in a box like this to say was your occupation? The Australian Office has something similar in terms of it's like only 12 letters. I see somebody's put coach is what they'd put in there. Well, just excuse my phone. I live in a region where the emergency notifications let me know about fires and things. Josie says that she struggles with that. Oh, I like that. Julia puts hustler. I reckon if you were going through customs or immigration, there'd be people who'd be wanting to have a check about what are you hustling about. Natalie says, that's a good question. I just put consultant in. I do too sometimes. And I got into a bit of a problem when I was going into a country. It was actually my own country of New Zealand. I was going in at short notice because there'd been a bereavement in the family. And all I was carrying was a briefcase. And that apparently took on a whole different meaning of what consultant was if I was coming into the country with a briefcase, because it was kind of like, are you, I don't know, maybe they thought I was a drug mule. Somebody says it doesn't really matter as long as it fits. Yeah, cat wrangler. Yeah, too many letters. That is a problem. Ashley says she's going to remember that one for next time. Yes, it's a bit of a challenge because it's like the world wants us to kind of be something very singular, very specific. And whether that's when you're growing up, it's like, what are you going to be when you grow up as if it's one thing? Or even at the point that we get a bit older and we're in the situation of filling out forms like this, like the ATO or these customs form actually think we're only one thing, because I actually reckon we're more than one thing, which gets to my premise about this notion of being in a workscape and having the possibility of trying out different things. Now, you've possibly never heard the word workscape before. That's because I came up with it. So here comes a definition of workscape. Workscape is a space in time and a space in society where an individual's experience of work takes place. And there's a couple of dimensions to this notion of workscape, which is why I've got this little image here. So we've got the notion of workscape being this breadth of time. So my workscape opened around about 18 when I started work, and I'm expecting my workscape to go to when I'm 90. So you probably start to see I'm already being a bit of a maverick here, and I'm rejecting the idea that things are going to finish around a 65-year age point of view. And often I think that's because people think work is this idea of when you're having a career and when you're exchanging your time and talent for money, which I'm thinking of workscape as something much broader about the kinds of things that I'm doing. So that's the breadth of a workscape. We can also think about of a workscape. I love it, Ingrid. You're planning for 100. You go. Workscape also has a depth. And so that's what the red one represents. So the black box there could be seen as one gig or one thing that you're currently doing in your workscape. That might be a job where you are employed, but then there might be other things, which could be where you're volunteering for something. Maybe you're being a mentor on the side. Maybe you're doing some blogging, which may or not be connected to the organization where you're working. So in this single moment in time, you could have multiple things that give a depth to your workscape. Now, in terms of that question about, well, is there a kind of a career-like thing or something you're following? There's another notion to introduce here about a workscape, and that's a workscape might have an era. Now, I don't know if you get my Kiwi accent, but by era, I mean E-R-A, not era as in mistake. So a period of time where it might be for that period of time, you kind of look like you were in a career phase of progressing something, a series of jobs that all hung together. Thanks, Sue. Kiwi accents rule, absolutely. That's why I'm a foreigner living in an Australian country. So if there's anything else at any point that anybody's not quite sure about, because there are words like fish and chips, quick, good, that I get confused, so just send me a message and say, Helen, please tell me what that word is again. Happy to do that. So yes, back to a workscape having an era. There may be some things that group together, but when you step back and look at the whole breadth of your workscape, it's like that looked like career-like for a period of time, but then other things jumped around. Now, what you're seeing here is an image actually kind of representing my workscape. So that data processing job in an accountant's office was one era. The second era I jumped to was then actually being at a travel agent. So, and then on the side, I had some things going on where I was being a mentor. So that notion of workscape, you're going to hear me talk about it a couple of times, but I wanted to give you some context for what that's about. Now, Elizabeth Gilbert, who many of you might have heard from her TED Talk many years ago and books and things she's done, I recently discovered a little video that she put on YouTube, and I can provide the link to anybody who wants it afterwards. But I love the fact that she was distinguishing between these ideas of a hobby, a job, a career, and a vocation. And I think this is a worthwhile consideration when we're thinking about experimenting in our workscape, because you might want to play with these notions of, well, maybe I'm having a job for a while, not a career. So let me give you a quick précis on her definitions. So a hobby is something that you do purely for pleasure. That's something you do for you, and there's zero stakes involved in doing it. Now, a job, however, is something that pays the bills. You do not have to like your job. It's a really key important thing that she makes. A job is something where that kind of social contract of I need to get some money because there's bills to pay and it's part of being a grown up. Now, a job is also something that could be taken away from you. And remember, you don't have to like your job. A career, you don't have to have a career. You don't need to have a career. A career could be taken away from you. A career could be disrupted. What she says about a career is something sort of more richer, holding together maybe a number of jobs. You need to like your career. When people talk about needing passion or purpose, that's probably something that's tied to their career, not necessarily a job, which can sometimes sort of surprise people because there's often a lot of rhetoric about in your work, you should have purpose. And what I would say, refining that is in your career, if you're thinking career, you should have purpose, but you might not want that for a job, and that's okay. Then the notion of vocation, and I really like this word vocation, and it's part of the subtitle of my book, Being the Vocational Adventure, is the idea that sometimes there's, for some people, a voice inside them that wants to be expressed to the universe. And they're going to do something while they're breathing for as long as they breathe. It may show up in a career, it may show up in a job, it may show up in a hobby, but you cannot not do this. This is something that's true of yourself, and nobody can take this away from you. So just interested, to those of you on the call, was there something about that maybe was an insight for you that's just popped up or been useful in thinking about hobby versus job versus career versus vocation? So we've got, they sometimes merge. I sometimes forget a job is just for money. I've decided I don't have a job. It's what I used to do. Yeah, it can be useful to kind of consider which of these things are. And as I said, job can sometimes be about money. Now, if you know anything about Elizabeth Gilbert, she's a writer, and she talks about the fact that writing is part of her vocation. And there's been parts of her life from a career point of view where it's been linked to that, but writing books has not actually been the thing that's paid the bill, so that she's been a nanny and a waitress and many other things. Now, for anybody who's doing that branding kind of thing, it's like which of these things am I? And then back to that thing about social identity and status. Who am I? What is it? If people ask, what have I done when I've grown up? They probably would think with Elizabeth Gilbert, well, she's a writer, but there are jobs that she gets to pay the money that have nothing to do with writing. I think it's really powerful if you can recognize the part where there is vocation for you. And as Ingrid says, they sometimes merge. And I think for some very fortunate people who have hooked into their vocation would probably bleed quite strongly into their career. And if they have some very fortunate opportunities, from a job as well. Thanks for those sharing. So I'd like you to just for yourself, and this is not something you have to share with the rest of the group, are there phrases that you have in your mind when you think about work right now in a world of being uncertain in terms of because often that notion about what I should be when I grow up or what I'm supposed to be doing or where I'm supposed to be going often has a kind of I should, or if only the circumstances would right, then this is what I would be doing. So I'd just like you to write down a couple of phrases just for yourself that right now you might be judging yourself by. And you can treat that word kindly. It doesn't have to be something about shame, but just for yourself that you're thinking about the next steps, what it is that you maybe should be moving to or could be doing. And the reason I'm getting you to do this is potentially the space where we might want to experiment. We can identify some things that might actually help us, or help you in particular, find something that's a bit of a point of tension that's worthy of exploring, or maybe an alternative perspective to challenge an assumption that's part of what you're saying to yourself. Julia's put down, I should be finding time for hobbies. Well, maybe there's an excellent opportunity for experimentation in your workscape, Julia, about hobbies. And you can have hobbies in your workscape. So I'm trying to use the word workscape in a very loose way to say in that workscape could be all those elements of the hobby, the job, the career, the vocation. It's entirely up to you. And I just want to introduce you to two people who I'm sure you probably already know, who have good examples of mixing it up in the world. So I went to Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin's profiles in Wikipedia, and this is the sorts of things that they have against their names. Now, these are two ladies who are either in their late 70s, early 80s. They are clearly not slowing down in the world. They've clearly been doing a number of things. So Jane has been has been an actress, a political activist, an environmentalist, a fashion model, and Lily Tomlin's been an actress, a comedian, writer, singer, producer. And then they've got other things that are going on in their workscape. So they were part of a conversation at TED Talk, at the TED Women, and I've seen them talk together about that. I don't know if you've seen the television show Grace and Frankie on Netflix. And why I wanted to show this is here's an example of some people who are mixing up things. Some of that will be jobs, some of that will be career, some of that will be vocational. They've got different roles and different titles. Particularly impressively, they're doing it in their late 70s and in their early 80s with no view of necessarily stopping. And as I see a comment coming through on the thing, I think, yeah, wine. Josie, absolutely. Mixing it up, put some wine in there in terms of the kinds of activities that you might be doing or the interests that you might be wanting to follow and pursue. So our options and what we might experiment is really only limited by our imaginations. But yeah, if you're at a point when you're kind of wondering, oh, I don't think I can do this, I don't know that's possible, just remember Jane and Lily. They're out there showing us what's possible and what could be done. Admittedly from a potentially privileged position, but that doesn't have to be a reason for us not to try. So often there's a notion that in our life that there's this idea of maybe career or something, that there's kind of a progression in an orderly fashion about what the next thing that you might be doing. And I'd just like you to take a few moments now and add another list for yourself. I'm calling this your personal unorderly list. So think about what if I was mixing it up like a Jane and Lily, what would I throw in my list of things that I could do? And you are not allowed to censor yourself here. So if Josie wants to run with the wine idea, she should run with the wine idea, but even maybe the wine ideas inspired something for the rest of you on the call. So put down some things, and you do not have to think of these in terms of, well, it has to strategically link to something, or it has to move in a certain direction that progresses from something. And there's this great quote that I came across, a guy named Zubin, who, Dr. Zubin, he's a medical doctor who I've seen makes lots of Facebook posts, and particularly talking about things in the vaccination. But he had this great quote that I grabbed from one of his videos. And he said, I wouldn't do it twice, but I wouldn't not do it once, which I thought was a great idea for experimentation. So what's some things you could write on a personal unorderly list? Things that you might do, possibilities that don't have to make sense, don't have to move in a particular direction, don't have to contribute anything in particular for the future. They don't have to link to anything in the past. And I think there's lots of room to play with Shardy Manager. And for those who are on the call who are wondering what I'm talking about, I'm just watching something from the chat where somebody's gone and made a mashup of a wine business and a change manager. Maybe that's something to go on your personal unorderly list, a mashup of two things. So I hope you've written a couple of things down on your list. Oh, somebody says, Overcoming Resistance with Riesling. That's a book I'd buy. Oh, I'm liking the creative possibilities. I talked before about in a workscape that often this notion of work is this particular exchange of money. It's that I have time and talent, and possibly there's been a contract which says I'll give 40 hours a week and I'll give my expertise as was listed in the performance description to an organization, and in exchange for that I'm going to get money, as if that's what work is, that simple exchange of money. So two thoughts. One is, in my experience, that is very rarely the actual exchange that's going on for work in terms of what people have that they're putting in and what they're getting out. But beyond that, if you're doing something in your workscape that's not, and I'll put in air quotes, work related, well, then what actually is the exchange that you are making for yourself? If you're doing something that's volunteer, if you're doing something like blogging, is there the same expertise going in? Is there the same time? Is there in fact money that so this value exchange is potentially one of the variables that we could play with when we're experimenting. So let's talk about you as an experimenter. Why might you want to experiment in your workscape with work? So here's a few ideas, and have a look at them all when they come up and see if there's one that strongly resonates for you. Maybe you want to just simply try something different. That's the reason for you to do some experimentation. Or it could be you'd like to disrupt the status quo. Maybe that should say, be a maverick. Maybe you'd like to reveal something that you don't know. Maybe you'd like to find out what does or doesn't work. It could be an opportunity to test your ability. So it's not that you want to acquire new skills, but the skills that you have or the tools that you have, you'd like to take them out for a run and see how they go in a particular context. And maybe you want to challenge assumptions. So we're going to look at designing a workscape experiment in a few moments, but I just would like you to think, if you're starting to think about some of those things that you put on your personal and orderly list, some of those things that are in your mind, is there something that maybe pair up here as an intention that you might bring to an experiment that you might create? Any one of those or something a bit different? I just put up a little quote at the bottom there. I love this one from J.R. Tolkien. It comes from a longer piece where he talks about not all that glitters is gold, but the part I particularly like is not all who wander are lost. And I think sometimes for people, this notion of experimentation feels a little bit uncomfortable because it's like things need to have a clear plan, a clear outcome. outcome and somewhere you want to go. And that's where experimentation diverges and differs from other kinds of activities that you might be. What if you simply got lost? Or you just went wandering and you had no destination in mind? So that's the kind of mindset that we'd like to bring to the experimentation. And Ingrid put a new one on the list. I like that one, Ingrid. Explore the edges of my world. Wonderful. So before we get now into too much about what an experiment is, and Josie says people aren't lost, they're just looking for good wine. Well, I'm with you. I'd go wandering for some good wine. So if we were to do an experiment, now some of you have probably heard of the notion of experiment coming from scientific backgrounds. You've possibly heard it used in business contexts. What would you then say is kind of the essence of what makes up an experiment? If you had to list 5 or 6 things that you thought make up an experiment, what might they be? Now, I've got a list that I've prepared, and I'm curious, and you can just write these down for yourself, or you can drop them in the chat. So we've got something that makes up an experiment is a hypothesis, curiosity. So there's something about a mindset of curiosity, that failure is an option, indeed. I'm thinking particularly about some things from a characteristic point of view that you could look at an activity and think, if I found these aspects in it, I would recognize it to be an experiment versus some other kind of activity. A Bunsen burner. Well, I'm wondering what the equivalent would be if you were not doing something scientific. When you keep that one in mind, because I'm going to tell you about a couple of experiments that I've been doing, and I'd be really curious to see whether you can figure out what's the equivalent of a Bunsen burner. So Ingrid has put, define the success contributing factors. Elements of fun. Imagination. Some interesting ideas coming through there. So let's results, a white coat. Yeah, maybe not a white coat, but maybe something else that you put on a bit differently. Wine. Yep, I think everything can be made a bit better with wine. So let's see about the list that I came up with. Whoops, overshot too far. So I think the essentials of an experiment, designing an experiment, is to have a question. And I could have put here a hypothesis, which I think sometimes gets people too caught up in the scientific idea of what a experiment is. But I propose to you that there's a question, there's some kind of question, like what could I be, or what could be different? There's the intentions, which we were just looking at before, like, why are you doing this experiment? Is it because you're wanting to try something different? So being clear on your intentions. And intentions here are different than goals. Other activities that you might do can often have a goal-like feeling, like I must get to somewhere and I must have a definition of success. Throw that away with an experiment. Have an intention, like somebody said, that failure could be an option. So that's the kind of different mindset you'd bring in. Another key aspect is variables. Now, variables are things that you want to change or things that could be changed. And when you're doing an experiment, you want to know what variables are you playing with. Aspect where you're maybe trying to see, if I did something with that, what happens? And is that something I might want to do again or not do again? But you need to have an idea of the things that you're playing with and changing with. You're going to need an agent or subject. Now, if you're doing these experiments for yourself, personal experiments, likely you are the prime subject and it's the experimentation is on you and by you. You'll need to consider the context. Where are you doing this? Because that may have some influence on how you interpret and understand those variables that you are playing with, and something from a time frame. So experiments generally are not something that goes on and on and on and on, but it's being really clear, when did I start it? When did I finish it? So that I can have a little bit of control or understanding. That was the moment when I started playing around with those variables. And that was the moment when I stopped and took a reflection. So what was it like to play around with those variables? What do I understand and what have I learned from the context? So that's what I'm proposing to you are the essentials of an experiment when you're thinking personal experiment. So, the scope of your experiment, and I'm going to introduce this language about a macro, a meso, and a micro. And that's because there are some experiments that are so big, so many variables, things that are turning the world upside down, that You may get great learnings from them, but there's got more of a risk and tensions associated with them. So you might not want to think about designing a macro or meso experiment today. You might want to go for a micro one. So let me give you a bit of a frame of reference for understanding the difference between these. So the variables that you choose could be something that helps define whether it's macro, meso, or micro. The risk that you're prepared to take or accept in your experiment. The resource impact, this is in terms of, well, how much time do I have? Is this going to cost me money? Is this going to need my attention? Is this going to involve other people? And then what is the amount of emotional tension that this experiment might bring out that I'm prepared to tolerate in my life? So if you're prepared to do a macro experience, you're basically saying lots of variables, high amount of risk, high resource impact, and probably high amount of emotional tensions going on. If you're going to say a meso one, you'll probably be saying medium variables, medium risk, medium resource impact, and medium around the emotional tensions. If you're doing a micro one, the low, 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 minor risk. So that's entirely up to you to decide that the scope of your experiment, are you going to go for macro, meso, or micro? And understandably, micro, easier to get up and running, is possibly going to net you something very interesting, but it doesn't need a lot of time, it doesn't need a lot of your impact, and may not actually create such an emotional tension. They're like, oh, I really couldn't afford that in my life. Why did I do that? So in your workscape, there are some meta variables that I put to you that you could play around and change with. Now, right at the top, there's value exchange. And I was just talking about that a few moments ago, that the value exchange of I'm going to put in my time and expertise and get money is one form of value exchange. So you might play around, what am I putting in and what am I putting out is the value exchange for the experiment that I'm trying. Maybe I want to play around with the task or activity that goes on in my workscape. Maybe I want to play around with the tools that I use in my workscape. Maybe I want to play around as a variable about place, where that actually happens. Maybe it's around the people that I'm with. Maybe it's a different type of people, or maybe it's the industry or context in which I'm doing. Now, these I'm calling them meta variables because there's more specificity for you to figure out underneath each of those. But this can be a helpful thing to think about. If I'm doing an experiment in my workscape, what are the things that might be things that I play around with, either across my entire workscape or maybe just right here in this moment, something I'm trying out? Well, 2020 brought for a lot of people disruption, and I'm sure we've all seen images of COVID viruses around the place. So it also brought a situation where I was like, right, I'm not happy with what's going on. Things aren't working for me. I feel the need to get into some experimentation. So I decided that I was going to try on a different skin. So here is a photograph of me in 2019. I'm standing in a room in professional clothes. I'm facilitating. It's very much a corporate environment. It's possibly something that you would recognize as something that you would do yourself. And now I'm about to reveal something that is currently going on in my workscape in 2021. This is me dressed, no makeup. I'm wearing runners. I'm wearing a t-shirt and shorts because I am currently, one of the gigs going on in my workscape is I'm an activity instructor at a children's camp down the road from my place. And I really have played with a whole lot of variables that I'm changing in my environment. And part of this trying on a different skin has been very useful to even just, I didn't do it for any strategic purpose, but simply to kind of feel like, what would it be to be something else? And it's got a time element around it. So let me tell you a little bit about this experiment. So I am an activity instructor on a children's adventure camp. I'm doing it for a 4-month period. This is a macro experiment because I'm playing around with the task. I'm playing around with the value exchange. I'm playing around with the people. I'm playing around with the tools. I'm playing around with the place and the industry and context. All of those are up in the air on my experiment. My intentions for doing this experiment were to restore myself by doing something very different. I was a bit tired and flagging, and I thought, what I don't need is just go away and sit in a retreat and drink Mai Tais and read a book. I need something with learning and a challenge. And you can see there's a photograph of me there with a harness on. Yep, that's the kind of thing that I've been getting involved in. I now know how to shoot a bow and arrow, do canoeing with kids on the lake, handle relay gear and climbing stuff. And things about what I don't know, a very different sector of work, which is outdoor education. I'm connecting into a team and strengthening the sensibilities about being in a team. And it's a very, very different team. Whoops, overshot. So I'll just give you a taste of some of the learnings and reflections around them. I apologize that there's so many words on this slide, but as I'm shooting through them, you can read as well. Some of the learnings and reflections, I might be in my 50s, but I can keep up with peers who are 30 years younger, which has been a very restorative thing in terms of this experiment. I've also been enjoying learning technical stuff. That's been both a mental and a muscle adjustment. So there's something called the ELF and the locking and the climbing stuff and harnesses. This is not something that's been part of my reality for the last 20 years. I've learned that canoeing with children needs some very flexible muscles. I've learned that what I've already got from my other life skills actually can contribute significantly to this work and task that's very different. It's been really helpful to think of outdoor education like a foreign culture. I've also learned that decreasing your earning power has an emotional impact because I'm not earning much more than the Australian minimum wage. However, there's other value that's going on in the value exchange here for me. It turns out that millennials as teammates, and I'm talking about people who are very interestingly enough, 18, 19, 20. So when they asked us, how long has it been since you've been canoeing? And I said 30 years, about half the group went, I wasn't even born then. So it's a very different group of people that I'm with. It's actually been very interesting to literally dress differently. I don't put on makeup. I take all my jewelry off. I've had to cut my fingernails short because they were getting ripped on ropes. And I turn up in this t-shirt and long pants. And one thing in particular is I'm loving that I'm not on social media or computer for this gig. So my experiment is still going on. It's wrapping up in a couple of weeks' time. But I wanted to share that with you as something where I have utterly turned up things in my environment. What's been interesting is a few people have said to me, oh, Helen, you've changed your career. And so, no, this is just an experiment that I'm doing in a place and time, and who knows what's going to come out of it. I have no strategic expectations about how this feeds into my other work. But then, hey, I'm here telling you about it. So maybe it has had some ongoing feedback into my other work. So that's an example of a macro experiment. In 2020, I also did a meso experiment. And so this meso experiment was only a couple of the variables. So it was the task, the people, and the place. And what I ended up doing with a group of people is we co-created a ritual for grief and loss with a group of diverse people online over 6 weeks. My intentions there were just to flex my creative and curious sensibilities, to be open what might emerge and get to know some people meaningfully and flex my empathy muscle. And some of my reflections were co-creations best done with an ensemble mentality, that there's joy that exists in cultural backgrounds, and that it can take time to converge on necessary meaning. So I'm not going to go through all of it, but it just gives you a bit of a flavor of what's going on in an experiment. So that was the ritual one. Now, there's a few things in the chat I'm just checking up. Oh, thank you, Ingrid and Sue. Yes, lots of people have been responding to my experiment, and maybe it's the fact that I am in my 50s. And one of the things I will say that has been really delightful coming out of that macro experience is there are people who are on the crew, that's what we're called. I think most of them are around their early 20s. There's one in her 30s, and there's me in my 50s. And a couple of them have said to me, you're amazing. I had no idea you were that old. My mother would never do this. And somebody even said, I want to be like you when I grow up, which I thought was really kind of cute. So micro experiment. Here's a micro experiment that I actually did before lockdown, in case anybody was thinking I was out in the world touching all of these glasses. So I was serving people drinks at a book launch for a friend and colleague here in Melbourne. And why I did this? Well, as I was serving these drinks, there was a bit of a social technical problem in the way the room was laid out. And frankly, I was bored. So I wanted to amuse myself. So I made myself this little experiment. And I was only a small part of the variable. I was only just playing around with the task and the activity, hence why it's a micro experiment. It was only in the space of an hour that this was happening, or an hour and a half, and there was low risk in what was going on. And in case you're wondering what I was doing, I was purposely, as you can see in the photograph, arranging the glasses of wine so they weren't all next to each other, because it was a very confined space, and people would come to a spot and they're like, can I have that one over there? And then they were reaching across the glasses. So what I was doing was putting a mixture of the wines all together in a group, so whoever came could easily access any of the wines they might have wanted in that region. It had some very other interesting things to learn about how well that was an idea, but it really stimulated a strong reaction in others, and curiosity and surprise, which had this really nice benefit. If people then started talking immediately, was often these networking things, people sort of come in, get their drink, and then they stare at each other and like, is there anybody going to talk to me? But it really got people talking about, what was she doing with the glasses over there? And it just reminded me about the power of place and context to affect behavior, and the significant impact of just a small tweak, and how that might actually change the nature of what was going on and the expectations of people. So yeah, there was a small experiment that I was doing. So I would like to invite you now to be thinking about what is an experiment that you might design for yourself. And I have created this workscape experiment canvas that's available in a little micro learning program that I'll provide you the link with later if you'd like to get into. But I encourage you, just in the time we've got now, to think about what would be a question that you would put in the experiment that you'd design for yourself. What would be the intention that would go with that? And what might be some of the variables that you might want to play with? Thanks, Natalie. Glad you could pop by. I have filled out this canvas in terms of the experiment that I have just done, which I'll show you what some of the filling in looks like first. But I just want to give you a moment to think about what would be a question that you could hold for yourself about an experiment that you would do. What would be your intention for this experiment? And what might be some of the variables that you with, that could be changed, things that you would want to intentionally try and change. You might also just consider whether you think this is going to be a macro, a meso, or a micro experiment. And I would encourage you right now, because I'd really like you to actually put this experiment into action, maybe go for something that's at the micro level. Can be a big question, can be a big intention, but from a micro point of view, you might just focus on one or two variables. Now we've got a small number of people on the call, so I had contemplated that we might break out into rooms and share what you'd come up with, but given that it's a small group, so this is just signaling to Julia, I don't think we will go to breakout rooms. We'll just see if people might be willing to share what they'd come up with.
I'm happy to chip in, Helen.
Oh, brilliant. Go for it, Julia.
I haven't necessarily got all the answers, but one of the
it's an experiment, Julia.
Nobody. It's not meant to have the answers. But one of the things I'm sitting here considering is what to do after VID.
Yep.
Or what should I do after VID?
Yep.
Particularly with all of this great videos and great people that I'm getting to meet.
Great. So that's partly the question. Is there something around your intentions that might go with that question?
I think the intention is finding out how it fits with the rest of my business.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it started by accident.
Yeah.
Kind of.
And is there some variables that you're thinking in particular that you would focus on as something that you might tweak or twist or change or add or remove?
Yeah, so some of the variables I've written down here are, you know, who is it that comes to VID21? Why are people interested in VID21? You know, or changing the reasons why people love VID21. So what do I do with some of the insights that I've got from VID21 in terms of the type of content and the way people like to learn these days?
Oh, nice.
Nice. Yeah, so lots of sort of.
Yeah, I think sometimes the challenge can become like you have too many variables and it becomes a macro experiment, and sometimes then it just becomes too difficult and people don't try it. So one of the things I would say to people is, if you're starting out to kind of do your first workscape experiment, see if you can hone it down to maybe 1 or 2 variables, something that you could do in a time period of maybe 1 or 2 weeks, just so that you get through the whole experience of actually designing an experiment and running the experiment. Because I think we can all have the best intentions in the world, and then life happens and you don't get to the point where you can actually see what the goodness of things are. So here's some indication of what actually was behind my experiment that you just saw me talk about. So the big question for me was, well, what could I do work-wise when I'm not sure what I want to do work-wise? What if? And so those my intentions are about restoring myself, learning from a different sector, connecting with others in a team. The subject was going to be me. The context was going to be a local business that was desperate for any workers due to the pandemic, which isn't the part that I had shared with you, but actually then colors what's going on in terms of the experiment, because possibly they wouldn't have taken a person in their 50s if they weren't desperate for workers due to the pandemic. I was in a situation that I didn't have client work and I was a bit depleted due to the pandemic issues, both financially and emotionally. So that was the context that was going on. You saw some of those variables that I talked about. And here I'm getting more specific in terms of, it wasn't, when I said place, tools and things like that, I've got more specific here in my macro saying, well, it's young adults as peers and kids as decline is the variable that's changed with the people. Running outdoor activities is what's changed from the task. I'm getting minimal dollars, but I am getting experience and I'm getting interesting stories. That's part of the value exchange. And then my approach was simply, well, I'm going to get trained and do the work. I'm going to do the work, and I'm going to expand the work if there's some opportunity, and I'm going to capture notes and images and stories as I go. And then from a notes point of view, just some things for myself. I'm going to need a personal cheer squad. Didn't necessarily think about that going in, but it turns out that when you're in a situation with a macro experiment with high emotional tensions, sometimes you just need a safe place to talk about things that are frustrating you and not have people coach you or solve you. It's just what they are. So having a personal cheer squad turns out to be very good. So Ingrid says, how do you define the subject field? Is it people involved? Yes, that's the subjects or the agents that are going to be part of your thing. Now, it might be in this workscape experience, it was just me, but maybe you're doing something that involves somebody else. And it's naming who those people are and then considering, well, what role are they playing? Are they actually an active experimenter with you? Isn't it kind of a co-experimenter? Or is there something that you're doing with them? So if you were maybe doing something from a coach point of view, it might be, well, it's me as a coach, but also the nature of what my intentions are and the variables is actually around the person that I'm coaching as well. So hopefully that gives some insight to what you're asking there, Ingrid. So you've just been designing your own experiment. So a couple of learnings from the field that I thought could be useful. When you do an experiment, you're probably going to need to craft a narrative to explain to others. Like I said, so many people think I've changed my career and I've gone off in a different. So experiment is just something I'm doing for a short amount of time. This crafting a narrative can also get to a point where people are like, so that's an interesting thing on your resume. Did you not know what you were doing or what was going on there? So yeah, crafting a narrative just for family and friends, but maybe also for that broader scope for anything that's kind of branding or marketing related. It's really helpful just to keep in mind it's an experiment. So some of those things you guys shared before about failure is an option. It's fun. You want to be curious. They're all things that come with the notion of about an experiment. So when things get a little bit hard or difficult, that just remember failure is an option, curiosity, fun, and keeping in mind those elements from an experiment point of view. As I said, recruit and use a cheer squad. Very, very valuable, particularly when you're doing a really big experiment. And make sure you capture some stories, images, and learnings. Now, you might reuse this in a very kind of business-oriented way, but even just for yourself, it's really nice to look back and think, oh, that's right, I did that crazy thing. And there's a photograph of me looking happy or crazy in that harness gear, even if it just gives you a bit of joy. Really helpful to keep those things that you along the way, because also too, from an experiment point of view, at a point that you're going to reflect, particularly like I'm going to be reflecting at the end of my 4 months thing, I've been noting things down in a bit of journaling and images along the way. I kind of need something to go back and look, because after I've been through the 4 months, I'll be in a very different headspace than when I started. So good to have some things that were captured contemporaneously along the way. So I'm extending an invitation to you that you might cultivate experimentation as a personal capability. Lots of people talk about it, that organizations do it, but my encouragement to you is it's a personal capability that you might develop. And my second invitation to you is to set a challenge of doing 2 experiments per year. Are you up for that? Do I get a yes from people? I'm seeing Julie's doing a nod for me and a thumbs up. Some things just to kind of, as we're coming to a close here. So work is a lifelong experience. I want to encourage you to think that nothing needs to be static or fixed in your workscape. Everything can be learning. You don't have to have figured out exactly anything at any point in time. Anything can be a place for change. And I'm not just meaning literally, like it might be conceptually, could be a place for change. And some things can be unexpectedly right. So this question about who do I want to be when I grow up, maybe throw that away entirely and just think about who do I want, what do I want to explore right now? Who do I want to explore being right now? Like me, try a different skin on for 4 months. And just as I mentioned before, that canvas, I've put together a little micro learning program that's available for $35, in which it has that canvas and some other resources for putting together your own experiment. And there's also the value exchange cards that you might play around with to kind of think through what your value exchange is. They're normally both $35 each. And as a special, I'm making those both available as a combined set for $60, not $70, until the 30th of April, and there's a link to get them there. So, any questions or comments that people would like to have me as we've come to the end?